Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're taking you back to the birth of global trade.
Hmm.
And when you picture that, you probably imagine something incredibly romantic.
Oh, absolutely.
We tend to visualize these like majestic sailing ships, the wind catching the rigging, intrepid explorers bridging the gap between east and west.
Right. Humanity finally uniting in this grand, beautiful exchange of culture and spices and ideas.
Exactly. It's a very persistent myth. I mean, we love that narrative. The grand maritime adventure.
Yeah, the heroic captains charting the unknown for the sake of human progress.
But when you actually pull back the curtain on how the very first trade route connecting Asia, America, and Europe actually functioned, that romantic oil painting dissolves pretty quickly.
It really does.
Because we are looking at a system driven by intense cutthroat geopolitics and this absolute insatiable hunger for one specific shiny metal.
Yes.
Not to mention physical conditions that were so utterly brutal that travelers were literally carried across mountains strapped to the backs of human porters in wooden chairs.
It's a very stark reality check. I mean, the swashbuckling myths, completely obscure, a machine that was entirely built on ruthless economic pragmatism.
Right. And that is our mission for you on this deep dive. We are stripping away the romance to examine the true, unvarnished economics of the Manila Galleon.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. This was a trade route that ran continuously from 1565 to 1815. And to guide us today, we're relying on a really fascinating 2019 economic working paper. It's titled The Economics of the Manila Galleon by Javier Mejia. And it just totally upends how we think about the origins of our globalized world.
Yeah, Mejia's work is crucial here because historians have, naturally gravitated toward the drama of the Manila Galleon.
The exciting stuff.
Exactly, the culture, the famous shipwrecks, the naval battles with pirates. But economists have largely ignored it.
Wow, really?
Yeah. So this paper provides a rigorous economic framework. It digs into the archival data to show us the sheer mechanics of why this route existed. Who was actually pulling the strings and why the whole thing eventually just collapsed.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we even talk about what these massive ships were carrying across the ocean, we really have to understand why anyone would attempt this in the first place.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about a 4-month voyage across the Pacific Ocean in the 16th century.
Yeah, it wasn't a scenic cruise.
Definitely not. It was a terrifying, largely blind leap into a massive void. They were battling scurvy, typhoons, completely unknown currents. So why take that risk?
Well, it turns out the traditional land trade routes connecting Europe to the wealth of the East were essentially barricaded.
Ah.
You really have to zoom out and look at the geopolitical map of the mid-16th century. The world was highly polarized.
Right.
You had these intense structural hostilities between Christian Europe, primarily led by the Habsburgs, and the Islamic empires.
Particularly the Ottomans, right?
Exactly. The Ottomans had solidified their control over the Middle East and the Levant, so that ancient Silk Road land bridge that had functioned for centuries, it was effectively shut down for large-scale, reliable European trade.
And right around the same time, the Spanish crown gets this massive geopolitical boost, right?
Yes, they do.
Because under King Felipe II, Spain and Portugal essentially unite their crowns. So suddenly Spain controls this unprecedented, sprawling global territory across the Americas and parts of Asia. But they are blocked from accessing those lucrative Eastern markets directly through traditional means.
Right, they can't go through the Middle East.
So when I look at this, it feels a lot like the 16th century equivalent of the space race.
Oh, the parallels are definitely there. I mean, when your traditional pathways are blocked by a rival superpower, you are forced to innovate your way around them.
Right. The roads to the prize were blocked by their geopolitical rivals, so Spain had to rely on bleeding-edge technology to go around them.
Through an uncharted void.
Yeah, across the void. They needed new spaceships and new star charts, basically.
And that technological leap is exactly what happened. I mean, the 16th century saw an absolute explosion in the applied science of maritime engineering and cartography. If you look at Juan de la Cosa's map from the year 1500, which is famous for being the first map to include the Americas, it's historically significant, sure.
But maybe not so great for actually sailing.
Exactly. From a navigational standpoint, it's still quite rudimentary. You couldn't use it to cross an ocean blindly.
Right.
But then fast forward to Jardins Mercator's map in 1569.
Okay.
Mercator figures out how to mathematically project the spherical globe onto a flat surface.
Wow.
Right, so that a ship's captain can just draw a straight line and follow a constant compass bearing. Suddenly, you have these highly accurate projections that make reliable, long-distance ocean navigation actually possible.
And the ships themselves, the so-called spaceships of this era, I think they got incredibly massive.
Oh, huge.
The paper points out this mind-boggling comparison to really illustrate the scale. Think about Christopher Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria, in 1492.
Right, standard baseline.
It was about 100 tons and carried maybe 40 people.
Okay.
Now look at the Galleon La Concepcion in the 17th century. It was 2,000 tons.
That's a massive jump.
It required a small forest of timber just to build it. It could carry between 300 and 500 people, along with enough food and water to keep them alive for 4 months at sea.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an exponential leap in carrying capacity and engineering.
It's a staggering achievement in logistics.
Yeah.
But, having the technology to cross the void and the political desperation to try it, that's only half the equation.
Right, you need a reason to go.
Exactly. You still need a functioning economic engine. You need something to trade once you actually get there.
Yeah.
For a long time, the prevailing assumption in Western history was that Europe was exporting its wonderful manufactured goods to Asia.
Like a mutual exchange.
Right. And Asia was sending back luxury items like silk and spices in this nice, balanced cultural exchange.
But the paper makes it crystal clear that this was absolutely not the case.
Not at all.
Asia did not want European goods. They basically considered European textiles and products to be inferior and largely irrelevant.
Yeah, they didn't need them.
So the real engine of this entire global enterprise, the sole reason these galleons braved the Pacific, was a remarkably mundane administrative change halfway across the world.
Yeah, it comes down to fiscal policy.
Policy.
Right. In the 1570s, the Ming Dynasty in China made a fundamental shift in how it managed its empire. Now, China, at this time, contained roughly a quarter of the entire world's population.
That is massive.
Huge. And it possessed a massive, complex, and highly localized taxing system. To streamline this, the Ming Dynasty decreed that from then on, all taxes owed to the government had to be paid strictly in silver.
Wait, so the catalyst for early global trade was just a massive tax law update?
Pretty much.
I was blown away by this. You'd think a global empire is driven by the king's grand vision, but it's really driven by a Chinese tax audit.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the global economic distortion this created. Because the Ming Dynasty suddenly required a quarter of the globe's population to pay their taxes in silver.
Right.
The domestic demand for that metal in China just went through the roof. And this created the greatest global arbitrage opportunity in history.
Let's make sure that's clear for everyone listening, because the paper leans heavily on this concept. Arbitrage.
Yeah.
Think about the massive price gap here. If you could somehow buy an asset in Europe for pennies and sell it in China for a fortune, you'd pocket the difference just for moving it across the map.
Exactly.
That's arbitrage exploiting a geographic glitch in prices. And the paper gives us the exact numbers.
Right.
In China at that time, the gold to silver exchange ratio was 1:6, meaning 1 ounce of gold bought 6 ounces of silver. But in Europe, the ratio was 1:12.
Right.
Silver was literally worth twice as much in China as it was in Europe.
China became this massive economic black hole, its gravity just pulling in every ounce of silver it could reach.
Wow.
If you had silver anywhere else in the world, the absolute most profitable thing you could do is get it to China. And by sheer historical coincidence, right as China's demand peaked, the Spanish were discovering the largest silver veins in human history in Latin America.
Talk about timing.
Right. Places like Potosi in modern-day Bolivia were churning out unimaginable wealth. Between 1500 and 1800, Latin America produced around 150,000 tons of silver.
That is staggering.
That was over 80% of the entire world's supply.
Okay, so the mechanics lock into place. The port of Acapulco in Mexico starts sending roughly 75 metric tons of silver a year across the Pacific on these massive galleons to Manila in the Philippines.
Right.
And in Manila, they trade that silver with Chinese merchants for silk, spices, porcelain, whatever the American colonies wanted.
Yeah, it was a highly specialized inter-industrial exchange. The Spanish weren't fostering a cultural bridge of shared values, you know. They were aggressively exploiting a market inefficiency on a planetary scale.
Wait, so all this romanticized, swashbuckling global trade was really just driven by a Chinese tax update?
Yeah.
The Spanish Empire was essentially operating a glorified, extremely high-risk silver delivery service.
I mean, it was a delivery service, but calling it that almost undersells the mortal peril involved.
Good point.
It was a delivery service where a significant percentage of the crew died of scurvy, or shipwreck on the route.
Yeah.
But yes, that arbitrage, that massive guaranteed doubling of your money the second the silver hit Asian shores, that was the only thing that made the staggering risks of a 4-month Pacific crossing worthwhile.
Okay, so if the Spanish crown is the one legally orchestrating this grand silver delivery service, I assume the people actually sailing the ships and moving the goods were the king's men, right?
Like royal bureaucrats.
Yeah, royal bureaucrats
Yeah.
operating a centralized monopoly, but the paper paints a totally different picture. It was surprisingly decentralized.
Very much so.
The day-to-day operations were run by distinct groups of hustlers who were chasing returns of up to 1,000%.
The profit margins were genuinely staggering, especially when you consider this was a pre-modern era with almost zero baseline economic growth.
Right.
But the people actually running this machine, they faced very different social and legal constraints depending on where they sat in the empire.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because let's look at the merchants back in Seville, Spain.
Okay.
To even participate in this trade, they had to overcome what the paper calls Iberian feudal capitalism.
Right, you really have to look at the underlying cultural psychology of Spain at the time. Engaging in commerce, like actually working for your wealth, was heavily stigmatized among the elite.
Considered low, right?
Exactly. It was considered low, vile, and mechanical. The Spanish psyche, shaped by centuries of the Reconquista, dictated that true honor came from martial prowess,
Right.
owning vast estates of land, and having a noble title. It meant proving your family hadn't soiled its hands with accounting ledgers or trade for generations.
Which creates this totally hilarious dynamic. The bourgeoisie would make an absolute fortune trading goods from the Americas and then immediately take that cash to buy a noble title.
Yep.
Just so they could retire from business and pretend they never worked a day in their lives.
Exactly.
They were actively defecting from capitalism to become feudal lords.
It's true.
But despite that intense cultural snobbery, some European merchants did push through and secured monopolies on the Atlantic side of the trade, but they weren't the real power brokers of the Manila Galleon, were they?
Far from it. The merchants in Seville might have had the ear of the king, but the real day-to-day power brokers of the Pacific route were the colonial elites living in Mexico City.
Ah.
They were the ones who dispatched millions of pesos down the mountains to the trade fairs in Acapulco every year when the galleons arrived.
Because they had the silver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they held the physical silver, they had the leverage to dictate prices, control the shipping contracts, and essentially fund the entire Spanish colonial government over in Manila.
And this caused massive friction. The Spanish crown would actually step in and put artificial caps on the Mexico City merchants. The king limited the freight values that could be shipped on the galleons specifically to protect those European merchants back in Seville who were feeling threatened by the cheap Asian textiles flooding the American colonies.
Yeah, it's imperial middle management at its finest.
Truly. And then, on the entirely opposite side of the ocean, in Manila, you have the Sangli.
Right, the Sangli.
Yeah.
They were the Chinese merchants, primarily immigrants from the Fujian province. And if the Mexico City elites were the financiers, the Sangli were the indispensable engine. When the silver arbitrage started, their population in Manila just exploded. To give you a sense of the scale, it went from about 150 individuals in 1564
Wow, 150.
yeah, to over 30,000 by 1603.
That is massive growth. They settled in a specific district called the Parian, right outside the walls of Manila, and they essentially built the entire local economy from scratch.
Yeah, they really did.
The paper notes, they worked over 60 different occupations. They weren't just trading. They were the bakers, the tailors, the carpenters, the shipbuilders. They manufactured and aggregated everything needed to supply the insatiable American demand for Asian goods.
And yet, the Spanish government in Manila had a deeply paranoid and conflicted relationship with them.
Really?
Yes. Out of sheer ethnic prejudice and fear of their growing numbers, the Spanish actually violently destroyed the Pafarian district multiple times,
Wow.
expelling or even killing the Chinese population. But the economic reality always forced their hand.
They needed them.
Exactly. They always had to allow the Sangli back and let them rebuild because the wealthy merchants in Mexico City demanded the goods. The entire global trade network would instantly collapse without the Sangli running the ground operations in Asia.
Man, I love how this reframes things. This sounds less like a centralized glorious empire and more like a massive global franchise operation.
That's a good way to put it.
Like, the Spanish crown owned the brand and tried to set the rules from headquarters, But the franchise managers in Mexico City and the Sangli merchants on the ground in Manila were the ones actually doing the heavy lifting, making the insane 300 to 1,000% returns and constantly fighting with corporate over the regulations.
That's a very apt analogy.
Hmm.
It was an incredibly decentralized pursuit of profit, operating under a very loose, constantly contested imperial umbrella.
But, with profits that astronomical flowing for over 2 centuries, you would logically assume that basically everyone living within the Spanish Empire got rich,
Right.
or at least saw their standard of living rise somewhat. But Mejia's paper proves that wasn't the case at all.
No, not at all.
Ugh.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of early globalization, we see a pattern that feels very modern.
Okay.
This trade route wasn't a rising tide that lifted all boats. It was incredibly exclusionary.
How so?
Well, the galleon trade created what we can call key players, which were Spain and China. These were the macroeconomies whose massive demand set the rules of the game.
Right.
It also created highly profitable intermediates like Mexico and the Philippines, who managed the physical flow of goods and got very rich skimming off the top.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then it left almost everyone else as an excluded satellite.
And the paper gives us this incredible, honestly heartbreaking case study of a satellite, New Granada, which is modern-day Colombia.
Yes.
Now, if you look at a map, New Granada has coasts on both the Atlantic and the Pacific. It sits right in the middle of the Spanish colonial empire. On paper, it should have been a massive, booming hub for this new global trade network.
Geographically, it looks perfectly positioned to be a massive transit hub, but its actual economic participation in the Manila Galleon was virtually zero.
Wow.
And the reasons why reveal the extreme physical fragility of this early era of globalization.
Yeah, the first reason is just brutal, unforgiving geography. The Andes Mountains run right through Colombia, but they don't just run straight like a single wall. They split into 3 distinct, massive mountain ranges, separated by incredibly deep, steep river valleys.
The Magdalena and Coca River valleys. And this topography created an almost insurmountable physical barrier between the Pacific ports, where the galleon goods would arrive, and the populated interior where the consumers actually lived.
And this brings us back to those human porters we mentioned at the start.
Yeah.
The paper references a 19th century etching called Monte della Agonia, the Mountain of Agony, and it paints just a visceral picture.
It really does.
The mud, the frequent landslides, the torrential rain on these mountain trails, they were so bad that you couldn't even use pack mules in some places.
No, they would simply sink or fall.
So human porters, primarily indigenous and enslaved people known as cigueros, literally carried merchants and heavy crates of goods strapped to their backs in wooden chairs,
Unbelievable.
trudging through freezing mountain rain and sweltering tropical heat.
It's a staggering image of physical hardship and exploitation. And when Mejia looks at the archival data to measure the economic impact of this geography, the numbers are shocking.
Yeah.
The freight records from the era show that moving goods internally through New Granada cost 50 times more than moving goods in a flatter, more accessible place like Uruguay.
50 times more. So having a coast on the Pacific Ocean meant absolutely nothing if you couldn't physically move the goods inland without bankrupting yourself.
Exactly.
It's like a city building a massive state-of-the-art cargo port, but the only way into town is a treacherous, muddy hiking trail.
The infrastructure simply could not support the movement of goods. The friction of distance was just too high.
Yeah.
But geography wasn't their only barrier to entry. There was also a severe lack of purchasing power.
Ah, okay.
The paper pulls demographic data showing the GDP per capita in New Granada around the year 1800 was just $27 US.
Wow, $27.
Now compare that to a colony like Argentina, which was sitting at $82.
That's a huge difference.
The population in New Granada simply couldn't afford the luxury Asian silks and porcelains, even if they could somehow get them over the mountains.
Right. And to make matters worse, they didn't even produce the right kind of shiny metal.
That's the kicker.
New Granada had a very active mining sector, but they mined gold, not silver. And remember, the Chinese tax law, the entire engine of this trade specifically demanded silver.
Yes, the entire arbitrage machine was fueled exclusively by silver. So New Granada found itself with the wrong geography, the wrong average income level, and the wrong commodities.
Strike 3.
They were completely locked out of the first great wave of globalization. It really shows you how razor-thin the margins of economic inclusion actually were.
Yeah.
Slight geographical bad luck meant total economic isolation.
It's wild to think about. A trade route operates for 250 years, moving unbelievable wealth back and forth across the globe, and if you happen to live on the wrong side of a mountain range, it's like it doesn't even exist.
Hmm.
But eventually, even for the wealthy insiders in Mexico City and Manila, the party had to end. The last Manila Galleon officially sailed in 1815. What finally killed this juggernaut?
Well, it wasn't one dramatic event like a war or a massive storm. It was the gradual dissolution of that perfect geopolitical and economic storm that created the route back in 1565.
Okay.
The macro forces of the world shifted. First, you have the rise of the British Industrial Revolution.
Right. The British start harnessing steam power to mass produce textiles and ceramics.
Exactly.
Suddenly, they're flooding the global market with much cheaper factory-made versions of the goods that the galleons were painstakingly bringing from Asia. They broke the Asian monopoly on quality and price.
And then, crucially, the great silver arbitrage window finally closed.
Ah, the price gap.
Right. For over 2 centuries, the world had been furiously pumping Latin American silver into China, and eventually even a black hole fills up.
Yeah.
The supply of silver in Asia caught up with the demand. That lucrative exchange ratio in China dropped from 1 to 6 down to 1 to 15.
Wow, bringing it in line with the rest of the world.
Yes, the massive guaranteed price gap that funded the whole risky enterprise just evaporated.
The economic gravity normalized, and on top of that, the intellectual and political environment of the world changed, right? The old mercantilist system, where empires violently protected their closed monopolies, that gave way to the philosophy of laissez-faire free trade.
Yeah.
The ideas of Adam Smith were really taking hold globally.
Absolutely. The monopolies that had aggressively protected the Seville and Mexico City merchants were systematically dismantled.
Right.
And finally, the Latin American independence movement swept across the continent.
Oh, of course.
The political ties that bound the Spanish Empire together, the vast network that provided the military and administrative safety for the route, were severed.
Yeah, that would do it.
The new Republic of Mexico viewed the galleon trade as a relic of colonial exploitation, a system that drained their silver, and they simply shut it down.
So what does this all mean? We call the Manila Galleon the birth of globalization. But when the galleon stopped sailing in 1815, did they leave behind a permanently connected world, or did the ties just vanish?
It's a complex legacy. In terms of sheer economic volume, Mejia's paper concludes that the Manila Galleon's overall impact on the global economy was actually quite minor.
Really?
Yeah, it was heavily localized to a few specific hubs. But as a precursor, a proof of concept, it was absolutely vital.
Right.
It proved that intercontinental global arbitrage was mechanically possible. It created cosmopolitan mega-hubs like Manila, where distinct cultures genuinely mixed. It laid down the mental and physical blueprints, the navigational routes, the complex financial instruments, the consumer tastes, that the massive 19th century global trade networks would eventually build upon.
But the specific bridge they built between Mexico and the Philippines didn't last, did it?
Yeah.
This is the part of the paper's conclusion that I found the most provocative.
Yeah.
Economists talk about a concept called trade persistence. We tend to assume that once two places trade with each other for a long time, they form a bond. They are permanently linked.
Yes. The standard expectation is that prolonged trade builds lasting cultural, institutional, and economic infrastructure.
Yeah.
You assume the paths become paved roads.
But despite 250 years of continuous, highly organized, immensely profitable trade between Mexico and the Philippines, when the galleon stopped, that specific connection completely vanished.
It's evaporated.
Overnight. For an entire century, there was almost no meaningful commercial flow between Latin America and Asia.
Wow.
And when Pacific trade finally did resume in the modern era, it wasn't Mexico and the Philippines leading the charge anymore. It was entirely new players, the United States, China, and Japan.
The sobering reminder from the data that economic geography is not permanent. Routes disappear when the incentives change. Hubs decay when the arbitrage ends.
And that brings us to a final thought for you as you listen to this. Think about the massive, invisible global supply chains that you rely on today. The intricate routes that bring you your smartphone, your car, the clothes you're wearing right now. We tend to assume that modern trade builds permanent bridges, that our current version of globalization is this irreversible, ever-tightening web of mutual reliance.
Right.
But looking back at the Manila Galleon, looking at those human porters hauling silver through the mud for 250 years only for the route to vanish completely the second the profit margins shifted, we have to ask, are the global bridges we rely on today actually built to last? Or are they just temporary transactions waiting to evaporate the very moment a cheaper, easier route opens up?